Joining me now is the Democratic Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security Committees. He was born in communist Poland during the height of the Cold War. When he was 6, he and his mother fled to the United States. He's also served on the National Security Council in the Clinton administration and as a State Department diplomat in the Obama administration. Congressman, it's good to see you again. You, of course, are watching this very closely, not just as a congressman, but as an expert on this in the State Department. And it's a little bit personal to you, as it is for a lot of people who come from this part of Central and Eastern Europe that borders or was part of the former Soviet Union. Give me a sense of where you think we are in this and what more America can and should be doing.
Well, it is personal to me, and it should be personal to every American, actually, because the Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom, for our security, as much as they're fighting for their own. We've done a great deal. We have helped the Ukrainians defeat Russia's initial plan, which was to take over Kyiv in a few days, to get rid of the democratically elected government, to impose an occupation. That has been defeated, absolutely, clearly. But we're entering a phase that could still be very, very dangerous, as Putin considers a very, very bad set of options from his point of view. What we need to do is keep the flow of arms to the Ukrainian defenders, continue scouring the world for countries that have weapons that the Ukrainians are trained on, that they can use, particularly air defense systems. I'm glad the administration is now doing that, and continue to ratchet up the sanctions. There are still a few things that we can do there that I think would make the effort even stronger than it is today. And have confidence in what we're doing.
Some of the things that can be done, some of that headroom that we've still got in sanctions comes more from European countries than America, because America's just not that big a trading partner of Russia's compared to European countries. What do you think success looks like for Joe Biden as he comes to Europe this week? Obviously, he's trying to use his decades of experience to negotiate a ratcheting up of that sanctions. But what would you say would be success for him?
Well, number one, there are still European countries that have weapon systems, particularly our Eastern European allies, that the Ukrainians need. And we need to encourage those countries and help them arrange those transfers as quickly as possible. Number two, you're right. The Europeans are still, and they would acknowledge this, overly dependent on Russia for energy supplies. It's therefore harder for them to move as quickly as we have moved to ban the importation of Russian oil. But I think they've recognized that this is something that they have to do on a much faster timeline than they would have been comfortable before. And there are things the United States can do for them, for the Europeans, to ease the burden, to ease the blow that they will suffer. We also have to talk about scenarios going forward. This could go well. We could have a negotiation where the Ukrainians find some sort of agreement with the Russians, a ceasefire, an end to the war. That would be the best case scenario. And we have to talk about how we would react to that in terms of the sanctions. But it could also go in a very dark and scary direction. If Putin decides that his only way out is actually to expand the conflict by testing NATO Article 5. And so in a way, the most important thing the president will need to do is to maintain that unity and that determination among European allies to have the nerves of steel that we will need if he does test us in that way.
Congressman, there are a number of conservative, far-right media personalities who've been on the wrong side of this thing, including Tucker Carlson. There have also been some of your colleagues in Congress. Josh Hawley said some things, Madison Cawthorn, and then finally Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said that peace agreements have been violated by both Russia and Ukraine. Finally, your colleague Liz Cheney, a Republican, called her out by that, saying Putin is targeting and slaughtering civilians in a brutally unprovoked war against Ukraine, a sovereign democratic nation. Only the Kremlin and their useful idiots would call that a conflict in which peace agreements have been violated by both sides. What's your sense of the fact that there is an influential group of American conservatives who are entirely on the wrong side of this thing?
They have been on the wrong side for years. These are people who admired Putin, who thought he was a strong leader, who thought he was a model for America. And look, it's easy to dismiss people like Marjorie Taylor Greene as just being crazy and fringe. But the fact is that in the next Congress, there will be more people like Marjorie Taylor Greene because they are winning Republican primaries around the country. The fact remains that the likeliest Republican standard bearer for president in 2024 is somebody who tried to pull America out of NATO when he was last president of the United States and who said that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was an act of genius. So I have a lot of Republican colleagues who are solid on Ukraine, who'd like to, find some way to paint Joe Biden as weak. Their problem is not Joe Biden. Their problem is in their own party. Their problem is that Fox News is broadcasting Russian propaganda to millions of Americans every single night. And so, yeah, it does worry me. We're solid. We're bipartisan in the Congress now. But there is a debate in the Republican Party that needs to be resolved in favor of America, our allies, and democracy. And it has not yet been resolved.
Congressman, we always appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.